Okay, so hello biology GCSE students. So we've got another one for our evolution and speciation, evolution and natural selection series here. So this is coming on the back of accepting Darwin's ideas and Darwin versus Lamarck and all that kind of stuff. And even before that, you should also have an understanding of the development of genetics, which leads us nicely into this. Now, new concept here called speciation, i.e. getting new species from old species, and a little bit more history. And I did say last lesson there'd be a little bit more about this guy, really important and underrated sort of player in the story of the development of our understanding of how species change over time. And that is, as you can see, Alfred Russell Wallace. Okay, so last time we spent a lot of time talking about Darwin, where he went, what he did. Wallace was arguably just as important, and if there had been better communications in the era they were working, and Wallace had been just a little bit earlier, we'd have been talking about Wallace's idea of evolution, Wallace's theory of evolution, rather than Darwin's. Okay, it was that important. So we need to explain his idea, and it's great that he's now on the GCSE syllabus, and we need to explain his ideas on the development of the concept of the species and what speciation is, so how we end up with more than one species. Darwin quite logically explained how species can change over time, but he didn't necessarily explain very clearly the driving forces behind what we now call speciation. Okay, so as you can see here, look, we've got a little bit of Alfred Russell Wallace's history, independently proposed the theory of evolution and natural selection, published joint writings with Darwin in 1858, and that was obviously, he was the push that prompted Darwin to publish on the origin of species, okay, and where he'd been worldwide, so on and so forth, working on warning colorations and a theory of speciation. Okay, so here he is, right? This is Alfred Russell Wallace, as you can see, another fantastic science beard, which seemed to be all the rage in the Victorian era. So in 1848, he sets off, when he's a much younger man than this, he sets off to Southeast Asia, so what is now Malaysia, Singapore, so that area, okay, Southeast Asian area. So, and he's basically out there for money, right? He's not a wealthy man, like he wasn't born into the gentry like Darwin was, and he's basically going out there to collect specimens of exotic birds and butterflies and things to catalogue and bring back to London and sell to collectors and costumiers and all that kind of stuff, okay? And he had a torrid time of it. So he went on these expeditions, just about scraping the money together, and he had an awful time, hardship, starvation, got malaria, got malaria, which obviously never really goes away once you've got it. And on his first return journey with this amazing collection of specimens that he was going to sell and make quite a pretty penny on, the boat that it was going back on caught fire and sank. So all of his hard work was lost, and he had to go again. So on his second trip, his second voyage, as he was out there in Southeast Asia, he was lying in a hut in a malarial fever, so the story goes, and he realises from all the islands that he's been to and all of the species that he's spotted, species exist in various forms. Those which are poorly adapted may die, and those which are better adapted will survive and breed. Now, where have we heard that before? That is essentially the same idea as Darwin and natural selection, of course, okay? And he writes this down, this idea, and he's aware of Darwin's writings, and he's aware of Darwin as a famous naturalist at this time, and he writes this down and says, hey, this might interest you, I've had this idea. And of course, Darwin, the bottom dropped out of his world. He was like, oh, I'm going to have to publish very quickly. But the advantage Darwin had, of course, is he'd been on his journey, say 25 years earlier, and had been spending that time gathering evidence and drafting his book. Okay, but he was worried that Darwin would be worried that he would be scooped, that Wallace would publish first. And in fact, both manuscripts got sent to the Linnaean Society, who still today are sort of arbiters over publications and so on and so forth. Both were read out by the secretary because Wallace was gallivanting around Southeast Asia, and Darwin was at home in Kent. His son had just died, so he was grieving for that at that point. And basically, the Linnaean Society kind of went, yeah, whatever, as we discussed in the last video. Okay, but what was interesting, Wallace also described this idea of speciation, geographical isolation, because he was going from island to island to island to island. this idea of geographical isolation being the sort of driving force behind the formation of species. Okay, so here's a couple of pictures of him, a bit more contemporary. This picture was taken on one of his expeditions here. This is taken in Singapore, which is basically, as now, a sort of base for exploration of Southeast Asia. If you ever go out there, it's very modern compared to a lot of the areas around it, and it's a good place to fly into. Then as to get in to arrive, then as now. Obviously, that's sort of more kind of what he would look like when he was out there. He spent an awful lot of time working in areas. So this is obviously in parts of Indonesia, that kind of stuff. He would have his writing desk set up and sort of, proper stationary equipment, very British way of travelling around Southeast Asia, to the point where one interesting fact about him is that while he was out in the jungle trying to catalogue his beautiful butterflies, he'd constantly have the problem of ants climbing up onto his desk, cutting them up and taking them away to eat. So he ended up solving this by keeping his table and his chairs in little dishes, the table legs and chair legs, in little dishes of oil that the ants couldn't swim across. A very ingenious way of sorting things out. He also was an avid butterfly collector, which prompted this statue, which you can now see when the situation allows, in the Natural History Museum in London in Hyatt Hall. He was particularly fond of the birds of paradise of Indonesia, collected an awful lot of those, and actually ended up with one named after him. This is called the standard wing bird of paradise, or S. Wallacea, named after its discoverer. And he harvested a load of those, took their feathers back to London. Later in his life, he was also a fantastic scientific influence when he had a bit of notoriety for having done all this amazing stuff. He was an early proponent of vaccinations, particularly around smallpox, and he argued with anti-vaxxers of the day after reading. So initially, he thought personal liberty should have, well, if you want the vaccine, you can have it. If not, you shouldn't. And then on looking at the statistics and the data, he became an avid supporter of vaccination. So obviously would have fitted in very well now during this pandemic. He also took on a bet to prove that the world was round. So he took on flat earthers, and he took on a bet from a flat earther and won. Right? He basically proved that the earth curved even on water using telescopes and canals, and won that bet, which the guy then refused to pay and landed him in litigation for years. So this guy, absolute brilliant example of a critical thinker, a scientific thinker, and someone whose legacy contributing to science is still with us. And in fact, one of my posters on my new shack ground, as you can see here, is about the different voyages of Darwin and of Wallace, with Wallace heading over here, to this side, to Southeast Asia, and Darwin around over to the Americas and the Pacific. Okay, so that's a little bit more about Wallace. But what he's really famous for is this biogeographical feature that still exists called the Wallace Line. Now that is Southeast Asia. As you can see, that line goes between Borneo and Sulawesi and between Lombok and Bali. And the insight that Wallace had, which was amazing, was he realised that, hang on a minute, all the organisms on Borneo, Java, Bali, Sumatra, they all look kind of Asian-like. They are the same flora fauna you would find on mainland Southeast Asia, up here, okay? Whereas you just hop a little tiny way over to Sulawesi, Lombok, Timor, then actually all the organisms start to look a lot more Australasian. You get a lot more marsupials, and the birds are Australasian. What is going on there? So he noticed on one side you had things like the big cats, large primates, things like the orangutan on Borneo, bears, birds of paradise, of course he was very interested, whereas on the other side of that line you got marsupials and cockatoos and things like that. And his insight was, hang on a minute, all of the organisms on this side of the line here must have evolved from common ancestors that are Australian. Okay, they've evolved and they've moved, right? They've migrated as far as this line, and they've basically met this line. And the same is true of Southeast Asian or Asian organisms, mainland Asian organisms that have managed to move down here. And at a previous point in history, presumably these were connected somehow. We now know about ice ages and sea level changes and all that kind of stuff. And they've basically come to this interface, and this line, which is actually a deep trench in the sea, is that divider between organisms that are Australian and organisms that are Asian. Okay, an unbelievable insight given the information that was available at the time. Okay, and a realization. And the water between Bali, Lombok, Sulawesi, and Borneo is very treacherous and very choppy, and actually quite difficult to sail across, and will be very difficult for an organism to come across, which has given us this very clear biogeographical line. Now, I will warn you, I think this guy's great, so therefore I've built a lot of my travelling and a lot of my biology, my own personal biology exploration around the travelling of Darwin and Wallace and other people, because I believe firmly that every holiday should be a bioliday, right? And you can take that mantra on yourself. I think travelling is one of the most important and valuable and sort of life-building things you can do, right? Hopefully the time will come very soon where we can all start doing that again, obviously in an environmentally conscious way. Okay, so to give you a little idea of some of the photos, some of the pictures, some of the things, some of the nature. Now, I've got a few photos here from my trips to Bali and Lombok. So we're zooming in now here. So this straight here is the gap. This is the biogeographical line where Asian organisms here on Bali and Australasian here on Lombok. Okay. Now, I don't have a huge amount of photos, but so I'm going to have to cheat and put some ones I've got in because, of course, when I went was 2018 and I was caught in a massive earthquake there, right? Which meant that photo taking and hiking off into forests got rather curtailed, okay? So, as you can see, look, I do like a bit of diving. Okay, we were diving around sort of here on Bali and various areas. Now, the water was so treacherous we couldn't go where we wanted to go, which was to Manta Point out here to see some big mantas, which just illustrates this biogeographical divide. If you ever get out there, I highly, highly recommend it. Whereas on Bali, we were looking more for this kind of large invertebrate sort of idea here. On Lombok, on the other side of the divide, it's turtle mania, right? So if you ever want to go diving with turtles, snorkeling with turtles, I can recommend the Gili Islands, particularly this was Gili Air, right? So again, I'm going to have to borrow some photos, but had we managed to complete what we were intending to, we were hoping to see organisms like this, the big cats, the particular birds that are all sort of more mainland Asian relatives, some of the reptiles as well, whereas on Lombok, you would see more marsupials, cockatoos, things like that. Okay, and for Wallace to spot this was, as I say, an incredible insight. Okay, so he realised that these different species obviously would have been split and they would have become different species in different environment. But this means that we now actually need to come up with some kind of definition of what we mean by a species. How different does the environment need to be? How far apart do they have to be? And how long do they have to be separated for? Well, we can all see that these three pictures here, within the pictures, they are all the same species, but some are very clear-cut and some are not. So these here, look, black bear, brown bear, we would have no problem saying they are the same species. Same probably with tulips, but look, they look very, very different. So we might, if we weren't skilled at spotting tulips, define those as different species. Same with the dogs here, look, our pug and our Great Dane. Well, we know they're both dogs, so dog is a species, right? But from sort of just looking at them, if you didn't know anything about dogs, you might think, well, these are very different species. We would know that these are actually just different breeds or varieties of one species. So the question is, and this was presumably a question Wallace struggled with as well, when does a variety become a species? Right? So when is it that we would say actually a pug and a Great Dane were different species, like we would say a wolf and a dog or a fox and a dog, a different species? Okay, and here's our definition, and this is the definition you can use in exams, and it's what we call the species concept. And it's not flawless, as we'll discuss. Right, a species group of organisms who can breed and produce viable offspring. What we mean by viable offspring is offspring that themselves can go on and breed. Okay, so if you've got a group of organisms who can breed and then breed again along the generations, we would say that is one species. Okay, now you might be able to see some obvious issues with a Great Dane and a pug there trying to breed. Can they breed? I mean, if we were to use artificial insemination, sure, we could get across with them, but they are probably not able to do that on their own. So really, can we call them a species? Okay, if you could make that cross, then the offspring would be viable. They would be dogs. But again, we're sort of pushing the limits of this definition here. And there are other organisms that push that definition even further. And I presume you know a few of them, and probably they've all jumped to mind when I started talking about this already. So things like ligers and tiglons, so a lion father, tiger mother, tiger father, lion mother, suggest that lions and tigers are actually much more closely related than we think. And the idea of them not being able to breed has been shown, actually in a lot of cases, ligers and tiglons can backbreed with lions, other lions and other tigers. So maybe our definition of a lion and a tiger as a different species is wrong, and we should say that they are two varieties of the same species. Okay, well, where's this line? So it blurred. Zebroids are quite cool as well. Look, you got a horse and a zebra there. That just looks like a donkey in socks to me. But that's a horse and a zebra. And then, of course, the most famous of these hybrid species would, of course, be the mule. Now, if we want to go back to genetics, the reason these can breed but not pass on, not make viable offspring, is horses have got 66 chromosomes, donkeys only 62. That's an uneven number. So when they make their gametes and they join together, they start pairing up starts okay, so the cells will work. But when it comes time for them to make their sperm or eggs, they can't neatly divide their number of chromosomes in half, so they don't end up making viable gametes, and therefore they can't breed. Okay, so our species concept is, as we've said there, right, a group of organisms that can breed and produce viable offspring, but it's not a perfect definition. Okay, there are edge cases, as there always are in all of biology. Right, so speciation is now this thing on your syllabus, this title of how we get two species from one. One becomes two. It's like the reverse of the Spice Girls. Okay, why might it happen? Well, really, for GCSE level, isolation is all you need to know, and pretty much the examples you're going to get are geographical isolation, islands forming, continents splitting, things geographically moving around, physical barriers. Although that is only one type of isolation. There are other types of isolation as well. There's behavioural isolation. So, for example, with the birds of paradise, you might think, okay, well, they're all on Borneo. They haven't been split up, so how come we've got 100 species of birds of paradise? The reason is mating behaviour. Okay, so for example, if you've got a group of organisms, all the males do a particular mating dance, and all the females go, yes, you do the dance the best, you shall breed. And then a small group of them go, no, we're not going to do that dance. We're going to go over here and do this other dance. And most of the females go, you freaks, what are you doing? That's not the dance, right? That's not the mating dance, right? But if even a few of the females go, I like what you're doing. It's different, but I like it. Then you've got a separately reproducing group, okay? Then they will obviously reproduce separately and eventually become different species. And then the last type, of course, goes back to our Great Dane and our pug there, which is reproductive isolation. For whatever reason, spatial, size, temporal, right? Whatever, their reproduction just simply won't work. In plants, it might be that their pollination times are at different times of year, right? It might be in an animal that their genitalia is not compatible, okay? So that will be reproductive isolation. But we want to focus on geographical isolation. And one of the most famous examples of that would be this idea here, look, this mid-Atlantic ridge, where all your continents, Asia and Africa, are on one side of the Atlantic, and then your Americas are on the other. It's why we've got things like crocodiles in Australia and Africa, and things like alligators and caiman in the Americas. Same ancestry, but as the continents got pushed apart, then they obviously became isolated and reproduced in an isolated way. So this is obviously a bit of geography more than biology, which is about tectonic plates and tectonic drift, but you will probably know from your geography there's a big gap in the Earth's crust there, and the plates are being pushed apart, so the continents of Europe and America are moving apart at about the rate that your fingernails grow. And if you go to certain parts of the world, like Iceland up here, you can actually see this crack in the Earth's crust, and if you're into your diving, you can actually go diving in between the two tectonic plates. That's a place called Silfra in Iceland, which is absolutely freezing, coldest dive I've ever done. And there I am with one hand, right, I've got my right hand on America, and I've got my left hand on Europe, okay, and I'm just helping push those continents apart, okay? So that's our sort of cause, is isolation. What happens after then? Another big hole in the ground, which is a cause of isolation, will of course be the Grand Canyon in America. Okay, so an interbreeding population of one species is there initially. Then the population becomes physically divided. Water, mountains, desert, distance, whatever it might be. They can't interact, they can't breed. That those populations experience different environments, and what is good in one environment isn't necessarily good in the other environment. So certain individuals of this population will survive, where certain individuals of this population will survive, and they won't necessarily be the same. Or it might just be random luck, genetic drift as it's called. And over long enough time, you end up with different species, the different alleles build up and up and up and up in population until those genetic differences get so great that those two organisms, be brought back together, can't breed. So in the USA, we've got our famous grey squirrel on one side of the Grand Canyon, and this black squirrel on the other side. They share a common ancestor, but of course they've been separated by that big, impassable hole in the ground. Okay? So, this is basically sort of the long and short of it, is that, well, why don't we see that kind of original species? Why doesn't that species hang around? Well, whatever the original ancestral species is, presumably isn't as well adapted for this environment or this environment as the new descendants. So the original species has got to adapt, got to change, or it'll die. Okay? And you see that throughout the fossil record. Okay? We're not going to go too far into fossils today because that's a separate lesson. But the original species will become extinct, and all you'll be left with is these two separate descendants. And all environments change eventually, so all species become extinct eventually, and change, become different, and that includes our own. And here's just a little taster of the next lesson, which is one of the most famous examples, is Archaeopteryx. Now, birds and reptiles share a common ancestor, and here is that link. Right, this is a creature that is quite bird-like, but also quite lizard-like. It's got jaws and a bony tail like a lizard, but it's also got feathers and wings like a bird. Okay, but we'll do more on fossils and more on Archaeopteryx in a future lesson. Okay, so if you get a speciation question on a GCSE paper, then this is what you do. Okay, obviously you've got to link it to whatever example it is, but this is how you answer the question. They're usually 4+ marks. Okay, so first thing that happens, you've got an individual population there, right? So this is population of whatever it might be. These are grey blobs. They could represent squirrels, plants, or whatever you so choose. So we've got our individual population there. Step 1, separation. So you'll need to mention what it is in the example that you're given that is separating these two organisms. Within each population, there's a mixture of genes and alleles of those genes within the groups. Okay, and that's important to mention with proper genetic terminology, genes and alleles. Okay. Natural selection, of course, will act differently. It might be a different environment over here to a different environment over there, and which alleles are better will be different on either side of the divide. In this case, it's a big river. We're basically rehashing the Grand Canyon example. Okay. Over time, the populations will change to suit whatever environment it is in their particular area, and if you leave that long enough, the differences build up so much that if you get them back together again, they can't breed. So, separation, genetic variation, different selection pressures, time, eventually they can't breed. Okay? And that's your answers to those questions. Okay? So that is how speciation works. Okay? But it's also true that if you have no environmental change, there's actually no reason why variation should and speciation should take place. So this is a little species here called the coelacanth, okay? And it's found in the fossil record 150 million years ago, that sort of time. It was thought to be a long since extinct species. Until in the early 1900s, fishing technology got better and trawlers started fishing deeper into the oceans. And eventually, well, up pops this guy. Now, how on earth has that thing been around breeding just as it is for 150 million years? Well, the deep ocean is one of our most stable environments. It hasn't changed. There's been no separation or change of climate down there. So this animal was well adapted to that environment 150 million years ago, and so is still well adapted to that environment now. So it's a great testament to the idea that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay? So that's speciation, and one of the best examples, and comes up quite regularly on GCSE papers and A-level papers, is to use Madagascar as an example. Now, Madagascar is obviously that little separate land off the coast of South America, so off the coast of Africa rather. So it's there off Mozambique. Okay, so this is the Straits of Mozambique, and it is an amazing place. Okay, absolutely brilliant place. If you get to visit it, it's a wonderful country. Unfortunately, a very poor and very poorly managed country, but it is one of, in terms of biology, one of the most important places on the planet. And of course, that means I led an expedition there, okay, with students, taking students out to Madagascar in 2012. An absolutely amazing place to see. You see species there that have been cut off from all the other species for millions and millions of years, which means you see species there you would see nowhere else. Obviously, famously, right, so there's me in Madagascar in 2012 with our guide, Henri, and he showed us some absolutely amazing species you get nowhere else in the world. For example, of course, famously, the lemurs. Now, that's a Sufaka lemur, and not only do you not see lemurs anywhere else in the world, apart from Madagascar, they've also got a load of different species of lemur themselves. So the lemurs have, as a group, are isolated, but they're also adapted to different species, different areas of the island, because it's very different in terms of climate across the island. So you've got Sufaka lemurs. They're there in the over in the west of the island, in the sort of the dry forests, as they're called. Okay, you've got ruffed lemurs that live there, in that sort of similar area as well. You've got bamboo lemurs. Doesn't take a genius to work out what they eat. And then, of course, you've got your ring-tailed lemurs that are down in the south of the island. We never went there, which means I don't have a photo of that to show you. You've also got other species of reptiles, so things like chameleons. All but I think one of the species of chameleon on the planet live on Madagascar. Their feet are so well adapted to living in trees that if you put them on the ground, they fall over. Right? They're very poor at walking on the ground. Okay, so Madagascar is an absolute case study, right, of this idea of speciation. Okay, so on that note, right, I'm going to leave that there. There are absolutely tons of other examples you can go and look up, right, of all sorts of different examples of speciation. You could be given anything in an exam and be asked to apply your knowledge to it, but just remember that pattern. It'll be some form of isolation. There'll be variation within the populations already. The environments will be different, so you'll get this sort of different natural selection. Allele differences will build up and up and up and up, and eventually they'll be so different they can no longer breed, therefore two different species. Okay, thanks very much. I'll see you next time.